Welcome to the Sword and Staff Revenant. I'm your host, Coleman Barber. I'm an elder at Proclaim Church in Bonner Springs, Kansas, and today we have a special episode for you. In our last episode, we announced that the Sword and Staff multiverse is growing. So this week, we are giving you a look at the newest podcast in the Sword and Staff family, the Ohio Howl. What you are about to hear is the latest episode from Ward and Jim as they discuss some of the experiences that Ward had while working on Shape of Shadows, a Merkel Media documentary centering on the ancient and odd occurrences of Skinwalker Ranch. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
It would not surprise me in the slightest that if the intent of your expedition, as it were, was to try and shed revealing light on deliberate darkness, that's an affront to people who want to keep it concealed.
We live in little worlds, predictable worlds. What you see is what you get. 8-ball in the corner pocket if you just hit it right. Rack 'em up and do it again. Just matter in motion, angles, and energy. Mechanical cause and effect, nothing to see here, folks.
But some of us are discovering that in some times and places, usually at the borders and on the margins, a strange underworld peeks through, challenging our settled notions of a sterile, explored, mechanistic world. Lights in the forest, lights in the sky, voices in the dark, a knock at the door, shapes in the trees.
My name is Ward. I make adventure films about high strangeness.
And I'm Jim. I make teenagers talk to me about dead people. Come along as we explore and reflect on bizarre experiences, our enchanted world, and mythic history. This is the Ohio Howl.
Ward here, coming to you from the absurd sort of command center I've made in Jim's backyard cabin, where I'm editing on my laptop while waiting for deer to wander in front of my arrow. Better keep it down, I guess. Two things were really odd about this one. The first, and least interesting, is that my microphone died about halfway through the recording, rendering my already limited contribution to the conversation obnoxiously noisy. I apologize for this. My audio is decidedly subpar after that. Although, let's be honest, we're all here for Jim's velvety baritone anyway. The second and more interesting oddity is that we seem to have recorded what we think may very well be a very strange EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, upon my first mention of a particular altar we had encountered while shooting a film near Utah's infamous Skinwalker Ranch. Here's the sound in context and repeated a few times with some enhancement for you to judge. It was strange, the experience of finding that altar. So we found the trackway first, and it seemed too on the nose. Like, here's human tracks that transform into horse tracks, which is kind of ridiculous. And that altar. So we found the trackway first, and it seemed too on the nose. And it seemed too on the nose. 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 Neither of us recall hearing this in the moment, and Jim's kids don't have any toys with RF or Bluetooth active to possibly be interference. This is the first time we've had something like this on the pod, and while I'm not terribly shocked, I guess, it is somewhat disconcerting. Nevertheless, on to the discussion, which I'm happy to inform you is devoid of any similar disembodied screeching.
Yeah, I rewatched Shape of Shadows this afternoon. I really did enjoy it. I think you can see the tighter production as it goes.
Yeah, we're getting better.
I think you are.
Yeah, we're definitely learning about the production side of it. And that was basically right after Expedition Dogman. When Tony saw what we had shot, he was like, Ryan Burns invited me out here to this place right next to Skinwalker Ranch. Do you want to do that? I was like, well, yeah, of course I want to do that. And it was still real, because we did Expedition Dogman for nothing. And we did Shape of Shadows for almost nothing. Mm-hmm. And it was just Tony just bankrolled that on his own dime and we drove out 30 hours to Utah.
Yeah.
That trackway was really strange.
That stood out to me. So let's frame what we're talking about. So Shape of Shadows was a Merkel Media documentary. You went out there to film with a big team. I think, there were 6 or 7 guys who were part of it? It seemed like a good coterie.
Christian, Joseph, 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a good group of folks. It wasn't like you and Tony with a camcorder.
Yeah.
It was a little more serious. And Space Wolf Research, where Ryan, who's the contact, was set up shop, is directly adjacent to Skinwalker Ranch, which is arguably the most haunted place on the entire planet.
Yeah, publicly known by the public anyway.
I would say, known by the public. I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking in esoterica and paranormal stuff, and there are certainly hot spots throughout the world. I can't think of one that trumps Skinwalker Ranch in the Uinta Basin of Utah. It's just everything and anything goes on there, and it's been corroborated for hundreds of years.
Yeah. People
settling there, people living there after settlement, people living there before settlement. It's consistently bonkers.
Yeah. Yeah, the ranch that kind of put it on the map was the Shermans bought this cattle ranch in the Uinta Basin. And it's really, I think the area of the strangeness is at least as big as the basin. There's also there's a reservoir, lake type thing called Bottle Hollow Reservoir, where there's a lot of UFO activity, UFOs coming in and out of the lake, as well as a bunch of UFO activity at the ranch itself. But the Shermans had these storied paranormal experiences. One of my favorite really high strangeness stories is the this giant wolf. They've recently moved into the ranch. They've got their cows in the corral. I think one of them is recently calved, and so they've got like a calf in the corral, and they're out there working on the corral fence or something, and a giant black dog, wolf, comes out of the tree line and walks across. They arm themselves, but it doesn't seem aggressive, and it walks right up to the corral, reaches through and like grabs the cow or the calf, I can't remember, and is trying to pull the thing through the corral. They shoot it like point blank multiple times, I think with a .357 Magnum to start with, and then they go and get like a .30-06 and shoot at it again. And I think when they shoot it finally with the rifle, it lets go, and they can see that they're hitting it. They can see that they're evidently blowing things off of it. It finally lets go of the calf and turns and doesn't run, but walks back into the tree line.
It's very nonchalant.
Yeah, it doesn't make any difference that it's being shot by significant rounds. And then disappears into the tree line. And I don't know if it's that episode or another episode where they see this thing and they like go to track it, and the tracks disappear like midway through a muddy trackway.
Right, where it's very obvious that it's a terrain that could easily capture movement, and it just disappears, which is very common in a lot of these sort of encounter stories. I think also of like the Battle of Ape Canyon. Are you familiar with that one? You know, where these trappers were out there at a cabin and they were trying to just do their business and kind of make their find. They were prospecting, they were also trapping. And that's like a big Bigfoot encounter. But they say the same thing. Like they can see tracks coming out of the river up out of the sand, and they're big, heavy tracks, like really deeply depressing the sand on the riverbank, and they just stop. And they're gone. And these guys are baffled. So I just cite that as another example of where there's some physicality interacting with the area, and then it just stops doing that.
Yeah. Bizarrely, the trackway we looked at last time.
That's right.
Yeah, I just thought of that.
But the Cuyahoga Canal.
Yeah. Or just started
with the railroad truss. Yeah, similar thing where there are obvious tracks, very easy to see, larger than we would expect, and we can speculate, but they also end in a way that is not consistent with just like a dog walking around.
Yeah. So Skinwalker Ranch, that it came to be known as Skinwalker Ranch after the Shermans had a few other episodes. I mean, these are famous cases.
Right. And man, they were for a wild ride.
Yeah. I mean, the other big one that sticks out that I remember that also touches on our experience out there is they were driving, I think the guy's name was Terry. Anyway, they were driving away from the ranch one time, and they had just pinned in like their prize bull, and he was driving away, and as he's talking to his wife about it in the passenger seat of their truck, he's like, says something to the effect of like, man, I hope nothing happens to that bull. We've put a lot of money into that bull. It's really important. They drive off to do some errand, and they come back in a couple hours, and as they're coming in, they look down in the corral, and there's no bull. And so they start panicking, and they drive down in there, and they get inside the corral to see what happened. And there's a shed in the corral that has like, I guess it must have had a door that was technically big enough for the bull to get in, because they had to get it out in some way. But they look into the shed, and the bull is like inside of the shed, totally like catatonic, like not responsive, not thrashing around or anything, until they go to wake it up, or until they go to open the door to the shed, and it goes ballistic and destroys lots of stuff on its way out. But it's just kind of, how in the world, teleportation, like how do you get how do you arrange that?
Right.
And there were no vehicle equipment tracks, no tracks indicating that anybody was in there to get the bull in. I think even like, I want to say that the doors, there was like still cobwebs when they looked on the inside or something over the shed doors that the bull eventually left. So yeah, that was the other like really big strange experience that stuck out to me. And it's relevant to other things. That the first really strange thing that happened to us on the way out there, we got word and pictures that within like, I want to say a week or so before we arrived, there was a full-size shipping container, like, I don't know, 30 feet long or longer.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. It's
like you could park cars in, kind of shipping container. And it had been there on the property acting as storage next to a shed. And for some reason, somehow, overnight, this shipping container had turned 90 degrees from its original orientation and sat back down. So it must have lifted, turned 90 degrees, and sat back down somehow without leaving drag marks, or it did nick the top of a rock as it turned. You could see there was like a rock top that was knocked off, but it wasn't like something dragged it or pushed it. It was just like it lifted out of place, rotated, and then sat down. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that didn't make the film that we found like the second day there, we didn't see it upon the initial inspection of that spot, because you could see where the container had been. The ground was like different color from the lack of sun exposure.
Right. And it looked like a barren, like something had been sitting there for a long time.
And there was a paw of an animal, like a severed paw. I think I showed that paw to one of the indigenous guys that we hung out with that week, and he said that it was a wolverine paw, which is an exceedingly rare animal anywhere and doesn't live there.
Right.
So clearly placed there by someone for, you would think, some reason. If you had a fairly rare thing, why would you leave it there? So yeah, it was strange. The shipping container thing was very weird, and it seemed sort of in the same spirit of like putting the bull in the shed. It's like sort of mischievous.
There was another Sherman Ranch story that reminded me of, because I'm familiar with the bull, but in the same way, the Shermans had restarted their cattle ranching multiple times, like at a loss. They're just trying to stick it out. And I recall where all their cattle had disappeared, and they realized that in a separate pasture where they had a lot of machinery, there's a big cattle car, and they were looking all over the place for their cows and found them lined up in neat rows inside the cattle car with like the back latch locked. And they were all standing at attention, similar to the catatonic state of the bull, where they were just kind of, bleary-eyed, staring straight forward, not moving, as if somebody had just like kind of swooped up 8 or 9 cows, put them in a cattle car, and then said, sit. And they found them there. They had no ranch hands on duty in that pasture. They had no explanation. They moved from one pasture, like another fenced area, to another. No gates were unlocked, and yet it was inside this cattle car, back gate locked, as if they were loaded to go to slaughter, and they were just dumbfounded.
Yeah.
Not to mention all the mutilations that happened there,
right?
Which is another tangent.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of, like, I still don't know if this is strange or not, but speaking of the mutilation thing, we found so many piles of, like deer carcasses, but I mean, the desert, they're totally like bleached bones, not recent kills or anything.
But piles of them.
Yeah. Like all through. So, Skinwalker Ranch, I guess to pick up sort of, fill in some of the history of the place, was just known as the Sherman Ranch. And then the Shermans wanted to get rid of it. I don't think anybody wanted it, except that there was a guy that came in, a wealthy billionaire, I think, named Robert Bigelow.
Yes.
Who was probably backed by the Department of Defense, even in his purchase of the ranch, who bought the place. And Bigelow is kind of an explorer of the unknown, I guess. He's really interested in the unexplained and strangeness. And he bought the place, and then there was a program set up by, I think, the Department of Defense called NIDS that ran a whole battery of experiments and tests trying to figure out, ostensibly for public purposes, trying to figure out the strange stuff that happens at the ranch, which includes like UFOs and shadow people and all sorts of strange paranormal things.
Right.
And those scientists had their a insane amount of paranormal experiences themselves, both that they were able to measure and not. And they sort of, to skip over a bunch of the experiences, and we can talk about some of it if you want, but they sort of came to the conclusion, many of them, that whatever it was that was causing all of that phenomena was intelligent and was avoiding their efforts to measure it or capture it. They would set up devices to capture some phenomena that exhibited itself once, and then the same phenomena would happen, but just outside of the framing of the camera or the sensor or whatever it is.
Right. So there were a lot of eyewitness accounts, but they weren't corroborated by where they had set up a controlled zone to monitor it. Right.
Yeah, it was...
and they would move that zone, and then what happened where they had the zone prior.
Yeah. It was
it was like cat and mouse.
They came to the conclusion that it was intelligent in avoiding them, or avoiding being captured. And many of them had experiences upon leaving the ranch where they would experience paranormal stuff wherever they went back to, which led to this motif, or the notion of a hitchhiker that follows you from the strange place home. that idea seemed to arise among the scientists there at NIDS. We were able to talk to one of the guys that worked security for Bigelow, and when it was under Bigelow's ownership, who had a lot of ideas about there being stuff going on there that wasn't what publicly was represented. His take on the thing, and this is interesting only I don't have any corroboration for this, but his take on it was that what was going on beneath those experiments, many of which the experiences have been made public, but what the effort actually was aimed at was weaponizing paranormal activity to basically as a means of psychological warfare to deploy elsewhere. Hopefully elsewhere. I mean, maybe domestically too, but which is a pretty wild idea. But an idea that also has relevance with some of the stuff that we ran into, and some of the stuff that the Johnny in particular, one of the natives guys that we hung out with, observed about the Skinwalker medicine phenomena, was he characterized it as warfare, as an act of war.
Yeah, that was very striking to me in his take, especially from his perspective. And I appreciated that Tony sets out in the beginning of the documentary to say, you guys showed up there in order to follow the lead of the folklore of the area. I think he said, like, he didn't come in guns blazing with EMF readers and all sorts of, scientific apparatus. The point was to take the lore at face value, what people experience and what they have said for generations has taken place, and try and look at it from that perspective. And I think Johnny was one of the best parts of that whole documentary, was his perspective, to be sure.
Yeah.
That this is something, and he makes the point, this is something that's happened for a long time before any, European settlers showed up. This is not something that just happened because they're spectators. This is something that happens because it happens. That place is pregnant with some sort of, reverberation, whatever you want to call it, just coming out of this area. And that the native people are very, very familiar with it. And his point about it being warfare, I think especially when he was talking specifically about the Skinwalker thing, that phenomenon, that this is something that is, it cannot be neutral or idle. It is deliberate and dark.
Both he and Bo, who was the younger guy that we ended up spending some time with out there, they both observed that it seemed like there had been an uptick in people reporting activity since the ownership of the ranch had changed hands from Bigelow to Brandon something, I can't remember his last name, but the guy who owns it now, who basically uses it as the filming spot for the History Channel reality show,
right?
Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. But so that was one marker, is the ranch ownership changing hands, one marker for an uptick in activity, and the other was they had begun oil drilling in the area. And Bo's framing of this, and I want to be, again, I don't know, these are the stories that they tell. This is their framing of what's happening. Right. Is that there are burial grounds all through the basin, and several spots, and maybe the entire basin, is sort of a sacred place where many natives are buried. And into that hallowed ground, the oil companies have run oil drills all over the place, and are actively, drawing out as much as they can. So, his version of that, and Bo at least at the time, was Christian. But this is the narrative, is that disturbs, to have your body disturbed here affects your peace in whatever holding area there is on the other side.
Right.
The good place. The Abraham's bosom of Native American conception. So, yeah, they associated both of those things with like an uptick in phenomena of strange activity. But Johnny, specifically the Skinwalker phenomena itself, which if you were going to boil it down, because there's so many high strangeness and phenomena associated with Skinwalker Ranch that sort of all of it gets lumped together. But at least from Johnny's description and Bo's description of what the Skinwalker phenomena is actually really close to what I sort of hypothesized is going on with reports of werewolves and dogmen. Mm-hmm. And that is that Johnny's history of it is even fascinating as well. He said that it was originally, I guess, as far back as they can trace it, it was a Navajo thing, that people that moved onto the land, encountered entities that were already there. Mm-hmm. And they made a pact with them to learn how to do this Skinwalker medicine, this magic. And the magic seems to entail a ritual in which you essentially, in which you give up someone close to you, apparently to death, but it's not as if the person is committing a human sacrifice. They just sort of turn it over to the entity, and then the entity takes care of it. But something about that pact then seems, for the people doing it, seems to enable them to appear to others as in different forms. So coyote, oddly enough, Johnny brought up horse.
But you also said there are not a lot of horses in the area.
Right, they're no.
That's kind of its own unique thing.
Right, they're not horses running around. There are wild horses in Utah, and we saw some of them, but not right there. But yeah, so that was his. Oh, and as they do that Skinwalker thing, that medicine, as a way of what we would call spiritual warfare or psychological warfare, if you wanted to, against the people that live there.
Right.
So, and some of Bo's experiences that we didn't make the film, honestly, are examples of what it's like to experience that warfare being directed at you. Mm-hmm. And so he had a couple of really harrowing experiences, seeing something that appeared to him as like some sort of demonic giant canid type creature that looked for all the world to him as if it was right there, real physical thing. Mm-hmm. And had affected him in such a way that, that he was still kind of struggling to try to make sense of it, rationalize it, understand what it meant for his view of the world, all of that. And at one point, after Bo had described that experience to us with Johnny there, I asked Johnny after the fact, I was like, is what Bo's experiencing the kind of warfare you're talking about? Is that the effect of it? And he was like, yes.
Yeah.
So it's not so much, I think
with the werewolf idea and people's vision of what like a skinwalker attack is sort of like, you get pulled into the woods and ripped to shreds like the animals that are mutilated. And I think according to the people that are there, that are familiar with the lore, the indigenous people that are there, it seems much more akin to spiritual warfare. Visions and nightmares and that kind of thing.
So things that stick out to me from this documentary is there is a lot of emphasis put on the evening that you fellas sit out there, and earlier in the night, maybe like twilight, you had found a circle of bones and stones with a skull, like a deer skull, aligned clearly to be some sort of ritual space. And upon finding that, seeing like clearly that's not a natural thing, somebody had put those in order, that kicks off an evening of lights in the sky and of different patterns of red and blue and green images in the horizon. Some were pulsating in rhythm, some were very discordant in their pacing with one another. And that also that talks about, even the day before you guys showed up, the producers who were on the site had seen, like they were just kind of looking at a binocular scope, and they had seen in broad daylight this kind of blurry beige object rise up out of the tree line, make some frenetic right angles, and then disappear. And they had held their cell phone camera up to the binoculars to capture it. And I mean, it's right there in the documentary. It's rather striking that even without tampering with whatever is going on out there, stuff is just going on, period.
Yeah.
Let alone your nighttime encounter.
Yeah, they had been recording. So across, viewers of the Skinwalker reality show will be familiar with this, but there's the basin, like the valley where Skinwalker Ranch itself sits. We were on the southern rise over that valley. If you go through the valley to the north, like you look across Skinwalker Ranch, you see the mesa, which they're always referencing. So the guys had been set up shooting video through binoculars of what appeared to be like a solar generator for some lights that was maybe halfway up the mesa on the other side. They were trying to figure out what it was, and so they had put a phone up to binoculars and they were recording video through it. And they didn't notice it until they started recording video. An object descended straight down, went from right to left as they were looking at it, across the field of view of the binoculars, and then straight up, right angle, straight up out. So like a U shape, right angles. And yeah, it looked like, I mean, it was hard to tell how far away it was, but it looked like it could have been anywhere from like, I don't know, basketball to like Bosu ball size maybe. Didn't look like a bird.
It did not look like a bird.
Yeah, and the flight pattern was really weird.
I watch it over and over and over again, and it's very clearly not an animal.
Yeah.
Nothing in nature moves with that geometric precision.
Right, it's exactly horizontal in the frames they captured of it. But yeah, they had shot that really briefly before we pulled in, and they got that. And then, so we had gone on this hike of the property just to like survey where it was after they showed us this video that they had captured. And we found the trackway with the apparent like human prints that the trackway then turned into horse prints. And we thought that the trackway itself was weird enough even before, this is before Johnny or Bo arrived to talk about it, I think. we thought
Yep.
that it was strange enough that we were going to put some trail cameras up. And so that evening, I think actually after we had Bo come look at it, that evening Tony and I went back down to set up a couple of trail cameras along this trackway, thinking that whatever it was might come through the same pathway again. So we set one up, and this didn't make it, because there's no way to communicate it in the movie, this didn't make it, but one of the experiences that I've had in a couple of places, and it's difficult because it could be so dependent on just psychology, but we'll like be walking around. So we set one trail camera and we were walking back toward the path, and I kept getting the sense that like this one particular bush was this humanoid figure. Like when I didn't look at it directly, out of my periphery, it would force me to like look at it and make sure it wasn't a person. And then I'd start walking again, and I'd be like, no, for real? Is that for real not a person? And as soon as I looked at it, it's just a bush. But that happened like 3 or 4 times in that area, different bushes. And I don't know, like, I'm sure that's probably psychological, but it was a thing. And then it's a thing that doesn't happen in other places. Like, I've been other places that are strange and never had that particular thing. But then we were going to set up the second camera, and we had to walk somewhere we hadn't been to set it up so it overlooked the location of the first camera. And at the base of this tree, it's very much like what you would call a fairy tree. It's like a very prominent tree. At the base of it, I saw bones, and because we had seen several of these piles of deer bones, I didn't think much of it, but I walked over to it, and it's pretty clearly a ritual space. It's an altar of some sort. There's a bowl of crystals in the middle, an offering of tobacco and coins, the circle of bones with 4 skulls at the 4 cardinal points, and a little like a little wood plaque on what would be the northern end of it with some stuff on it, and like objects, not writing. No one said Skinwalker magic here, but Tony was looking, turns around and goes, he looks at it and he goes, "Is that what I think it is?" And I thought he saw it, so I said, "Yep." But anyway, after he got down, he walked over and he was like, "Oh, what in the world?" We started walking back up to camp because it's getting dark, and we're both sort of reflecting on what it means that this thing is right there, so close to camp. Because it sort of feels like you're being put on at that point. Like, okay, we came out here, here's a trackway of human prints turning into that, and then here's an altar that looks, you know. And I remember he remarked, I think first as we were walking up toward the campfire, he's like, "You feel like we're being watched?" And it did feel that way. And so we stopped right there, and I was like, you know what they never tried at NIDS, because they were talking about how the intelligent thing would avoid their experimentation. I was like, I bet they never tried praying about it.
Yeah.
And so we stopped and we prayed that, you know, whatever, I think it was, you know, whatever we were meant to see and tell, that we would see and tell, and that whatever entities might object to that would be foiled in their attempts. And then as we're walking back up to the camp, having talked about feeling watched, Bo turns to us and sees us walking to the campfire, and he goes, "You guys are being followed." It's like the first thing he said. And he did, I don't think he heard us. We were, you know, 50 yards away or something when we prayed. And so, we were like, "Why do you say that?" It was like, you know, I feel it or whatever. And so we said, "Well, it's funny you said that because we saw this thing, we passed it around." And as we're all looking at the, we're describing it to everyone around the campfire and passing the picture around, it gets just the idea that that blood, innocent blood, calls out from the land for the Avenger of Blood. That's another one of those ubiquitous things that's also referenced in Scripture. But
Right. Yeah.
in this river live, according to locals, a creature. There's a bunch of creatures referred to as water babies. And water babies seem to be the spirits of drowned infants that were drowned in that river that call to you if you stay down there at dusk, if you can brave the mosquitoes, and there are a lot of them. The water babies will lure you out into the water, sort of like the water fae legend.
Or like sirens. So yeah, all the same.
And will drag you down if you go out there into the river. And the idea is that that section of river was desecrated by the murder of infants, which is an interesting, in when Moses visits blood on the Nile and blood on the water. It's a pretty direct, I think a pretty direct response to Pharaoh having drowned all the sons of Israel that he could in the river. But anyway, so there's one sort of lore-related rationale for why the place is desecrated or why the place is the way that it is, or an example of it, I guess. The others, we were talking earlier about the relationship between the Fremont people who lived in that area, the Anasazi who lived to the southeast of that, and cannibalism, which, you probably know more about the Anasazi than I do. I know that they're like 800 to 1300 AD, the Chaco Canyon is a giant complex of rather inexplicable circular dwellings that was formed.
And up on the cliffs.
Yep, in this canyon, right around the Four Corners area. And they, in the archaeological finds there, they found human remains with tool marks and evidence of being boiled and that kind of thing that evidence cannibalism as a practice among the inhabitants of that complex. And this was controversial a few years ago, but just because the Anasazi were supposed to be, a paragon example of advanced civilization before Europeans arrived, and to accuse them of cannibalism was seen as racist and whatever else. But I think your point that you made earlier was that the Anasazi might have been victims of the cannibalism.
Right, something else might have been eating them.
Right, which relates back to some of the Uinta Basin stuff. One of the things that we went and saw our last day was this one site that's an example of the Fremont people's petroglyphs. Now, the Fremont people are only divided from the Anasazi by a few cultural markers that archaeologists have discovered, like I think one of the main ones is a particular way that they made a basket. But there's agreement that aside from this one particular way they made a basket, and maybe a couple other things, the Fremont and the Anasazi trafficked among each other.
Yeah.
So they're not really distinct cultures that way. But some of the Fremont petroglyphs that they left, and the Fremont were cliff dwellers proper. Like there is no Chaco Canyon up there. It's literally they lived in holes in the canyons, holes in the cliffs. And near their dwellings, they left petroglyphs, many of them. They depict lots of different things, some of them pretty weird. Like, for instance, six-fingered giants that are, some people take the petroglyphs to indicate that they're holding the heads of people. But usually if you come to hold the head of a person, you might have ate the rest of them. So there's some indication in the petroglyphs that there was something that in the depictions in the petroglyphs are larger than other human figures. They're often depicted wearing ceremonial like headdresses and paraphernalia, necklaces and such, with on occasion 6 digits, and eating people, or at least holding their heads. We're not too far from the every French Christian's favorite topic, the Nephilim giants eating people.
Especially the Enochian account.
Yeah. So, and there are documented, like, evidently I believe it's the Anasazi also frequently depicts small 5-toed footprints next to much larger 6-toed footprints, as if there was some significance to that symbol.
Right.
Which is pretty interesting, and points toward a legend and a piece of lore that Johnny also relayed to us as being a part of oral tradition about 6-fingered, red-haired giants that eat you, which seems like a somewhat ubiquitous tale across Native American tribes. So
it is, right. And we can get into this maybe in another discussion in more detail, but it seems, as I read First Nation accounts, that this is like a universal scourge on their lands. That there are other people who have a bent against the average Native American person. And as you say, this kind of red-haired, white-skinned personage. And that's not just the Fremont and the Anasazi who talk about it. That's like just spin the wheel and pick a First Nation tribe. The Sioux talk about it, the Cherokee talk about it, the Algonquin talk about it. And when we think about the Anasazi, it's so interesting because the biggest historical conundrum is we clearly have archaeological evidence of the Anasazi living and flourishing in bottom canyons, in plains, in river valleys, in open and less guarded places where they flourished. And then, as we alluded to earlier, around 1300 AD, the archaeological evidence shows that they all fled from these places up into like fortress mesas, where there's one way up to the top of this butte or this mesa. And at the top of that one-way road, there are pueblos and impressively complex structures that are built into the cliff faces that could house, some of these are as small as 2 or 3 families could live there. Some of these are as impressive as 2,000 people could live in here. And so all of a sudden you see this sudden shift across this area where people are fleeing in droves to these places of protection, of these kind of strategic choke points. And there's still art flourishing there, there's still culture flourishing there, but you clearly see this kind of backpedaling to get away from some great existential threat. And that is where there are accounts of these pueblos being littered with fragmented skeletons and evidence of cannibalism, not just in worked bones, but also in like fecal remains that have myoglobin in them that have been checked out by archaeologists and anthropologists innumerable. There's clear evidence of cannibalism, or at least some people being eaten by other people. And in some cases, it's very gruesome. It's not just like the fallout from warfare. It's like small skeletons with their mouths and jaws smashed in and all the teeth are broken out. Like, that's not what you do when you're just waging warfare against somebody. It's kind of a brutalism of the human body. And when we see the context of, and it could merely be circumstantial context, but the context that you have this known quantity of much larger polydactyl humans, 6 toes, 6 fingers, and deliberately described as such in petroglyphs and pictographs and those things, in contrast to what is clearly presented as the average person, that it leaves something to be considered, that perhaps this cannibalism and this exodus and this spiritual darkness that is surrounded by like the occult garb and these spiral portal symbols and the places where we see the First Nations clearly try to indicate this is something beyond what is normal, is taking place at a catastrophic rate. And then these civilizations disappear, or they disperse so thoroughly that they engraft into other cultures and they're lost. They just syncretize until they no longer have their own thread.
Yeah.
So do you think, Ward,
that's funny?
Yeah, go ahead.
When we were at that Fremont complex, one of the things that we were speculating on is why go to the effort of getting all the way up there, because it's a hike.
It's an amazing trek.
Yeah.
This is a feat for a culture to produce en masse.
Yeah. And why make, like, the way up there is a tiny, like 3-foot wide track.
Yeah.
To get up to the cliff dwellings. And so we were, to stand there and have the experience of looking at it, you do kind of, like, what could have motivated you to live up there?
Right.
They had like early agriculture implements and stuff, and that's not the easiest way to get down to access your crops and stuff. You have to go all the way down this time.
Right, there's no water source up on these buttes and mesas.
Yeah. You got to go down and get it and hike all the way back up. It's pretty strange.
Yeah, there's an article you share with me from the Smithsonian magazine on it's titled "The Riddle of the Anasazi." And there are a few points here that I think are very interesting. Until recently, because of a popular and ingrained perception of that sedentary ancient culture as peaceful, archaeologists have been reluctant to acknowledge that the Anasazi could have been violent. And this entire article is, I think, trying to make the case that they were pushed to the edge of extinction, and so they had to resort to brutal means to survive. Castle Rock is the major site of the Anasazi that is cited as the place where most of this brutalism took place. The article goes on to say that an even more grisly picture emerges at Castle Rock, a butte of sandstone that erupts 70 feet out of bedrock in Mount Elmo Canyon. And the author here says, I went there with my researcher to meet an archaeologist with the Crow Canyon Center who co-led a dig at the base of the butte. Here the Anasazi crafted blocks of rooms and even built structures in the butte's summit. Crow Canyon Center archaeologists excavated the settlement between 1990 and 1994 and found dozens of rooms, multiple complexes that could house at least 150 people. These are, folks who are fleeing and trying to build basically like a bug-out shelter in the context of the, early medieval age in America. Suspicions of Anasazi cannibalism were first raised in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until the 1970s that a handful of physical anthropologists really pushed the argument. These anthropologists developed 6 criteria for detecting cannibalism from bones: the breaking of long bones to get marrow, cut marks on bones made by stone knives, the burning of bones, anvil abrasions resulting from placing a bone on a rock and pounding it with another rock, the pulverizing of vertebrae, and, quote, pot polishing, a sheen left on bones when they were boiled for a long time in a clay vessel. And to be fair, this article suggests that the people who originally pushed this thesis were immediately anathematized. Because again, as we kind of start off the discussion, it's saying, hey, these First Nation peoples, they were horrible. And that's not what the researchers are trying to say, but that's an inference from the data, perhaps in a very unfair, uncivil correlation.
Kind of a ham-fisted way.
Right, it's very ham-fisted, right.
The thing is, those people, it's not the same people.
Right.
The Fremont and the Anasazi, it's like the Adena and the Hopewell.
Right.
These are not the same. These are not what you think of as Native Americans. Like,
right.
It's not your Cherokee friend. It's
right.
A different people group. It's kind of, it's, I don't know. It's sort of ludicrous to treat all Native Americans as members of the same.
Right, it's just a Native American. Like that's, I mean, in our current era where we're trying to be as detailed and prescient about nuance and distinction as possible, a lot of these citations are people saying, well, you're just lumping everything together, which I would agree is kind of a bad take. And again, some of this hints at another conversation that we might have at a later time regarding this kind of giant presence in North America. But to bring it full circle, like we're talking about the Anasazi, we're talking about the Fremont people, we're talking about these petroglyphs. How does this relate back then to Skinwalker Ranch? Like, these are related, but they are distinct categories and distinct conversations. So let's bring it back to Shape of Shadows and think about, like, how does that backstory, which I think is worth our having gone through that, but how does that then point to whatever the heck is going on in the Uinta Basin?
Right. So I would point to the general principle, which I think as Christians who seek to subject all myth to Scripture, we have a pattern that innocent blood cries out from the land for an avenger of blood. Mm-hmm. That's the principle. So, when it so happens that a particular area has a rich and storied history of violence, desecration, much like Appalachia is known as the dark and bloody ground.
Yep.
I think that we're on fairly solid footing to say that there might be some correlation between the place where those things happen and spiritual darkness. And so I mean, that's one of the ways, and that may correlate as well with geographically related principalities over certain areas, in certain bents or MOs within which they operate. So, and that's, that part is pretty speculative, but I think the idea of innocent blood cries out from the ground in some sense. Like, there's a reason that I'm gonna mess that. I think it's in Genesis when Cain kills Abel.
Right. Yep.
Abel's blood cries out not from nowhere, but it cries out from the ground. Like, there's a relationship between the place where a thing happens, and I don't pretend to understand it, but there appears to be some relationship there.
And that's echoed in Hebrews in the New Testament, citing that directly. That, as Christ's blood is shed, so his blood cries out even greater than Abel's from the ground.
Yeah.
Speaking of a more cosmic significance.
Yeah. Yeah, so as far as like that's the relationship that I see between, in the strongest, the least conservative conception of like the Fremont petroglyphs and the Anasazi. Perhaps this is being visited upon those people by some other people that inherited this practice from somewhere. And that's often, it's not just like eating people because you're hungry. It's usually ritualistic.
Right.
And that kind of sin, that kind of desecration, perhaps sticks with the land.
I think there's something to it. I really do. I think that if we're taking the tack, which I think is a biblically orthodox path, that if man bears the image of God, then the slaughter of man is a desecration. The abuse of man is a desecration. And that these things are not merely physical, they are metaphysical, they are spiritual. There is lasting significance to the abuse of an image bearer. And if this is a place that perhaps had some deep history, ritual abuse, for whatever reason, people beyond what we can understand now found themselves in the Uinta Basin and they said, this is a place where we will set up shop for butchery, cannibalism, massacre, violence, death. It leaves an imprint. And that's not to be woo. That's not to say, everything has some sort of like spiritual fingerprint that has to be gone back by somebody else to, clean up the crime scene. But I do think that, as we've talked in the past, North America is unique in that entrenched paganism has subsisted there and survived for much longer than the rest of the world. And I'm not just talking about North America, I'm talking Mesoamerica and South America, like the Americas. They're a place where we can, you can wax poetic of like we're the lost tribes of the Jews stranded on the New England coast and they made their way in. Were there giants that were cast out and expelled by Joshua's conquest of Canaan and they also got on ships and pieced out to the left? There are some strange rocks across America that show like vessels, seafaring vessels that look like Phoenician ships, which would have been related to this sort of giant culture. Yeah, that stuff is there, and we can only speculate so far, but I do think that if nothing else, we have to reckon with the fact that bad medicine, so to speak, spiritually speaking, and I think very sincerely spiritually speaking, has been going on in this land for longer than elsewhere in the world. And we may never have a perfect picture of who were here, what cultures were interacting, who were these white-skinned, red-haired, six-toed people. We don't know. Maybe we'll never know. But there's such a cultural consciousness of all of these different intersection points lining up in these areas that it suggests to me that there's something untoward that has been let to live for longer than it should be. And if we're trying to, always bridge the gap, we're trying to analyze biblically what is paranormal phenomena. It's not just, wacky ghost stories in grandma's attic. It's spiritual darkness. And if these patterns of behavior are taking place for a long time unchecked, they're probably going to leave their mark. And maybe somebody listening will say, that's ridiculous, and how do you found that? I don't know. I just think, like, we look at even the Old Testament pattern, like Canaan itself, people rail all the time. They have the Christopher Hitchens' argument as God as some sort of genocidal maniac saying, Joshua, go in and kill all the people here. Well, they've been there for 400 years. And in Canaan, people were given the opportunity to repent over and over and over and over again. And Abraham's legacy was there for generations to suggest to them, hey, this is not the way to live your life. By the time they are unrepentant, they're wiped out. I heard a great argument recently, Ward, where the name of the apologist escapes me, but he made a good point saying, all the time, atheistic commentators are so upset when God does nothing to solve the evil in the world, and then he does, and they get upset because he solved the evil in the world. The corruption of Canaan was so deep and dark, absolutely pitch black. And God says, it's time to wipe this out. And he says, we're going to go clean up the act and spiritually cleanse this area. And now suddenly that's an affront to morality somewhere, because God actually, lifted a finger when everybody else was condemning him for never doing so. So I think about a place like Skinwalker Ranch where we can't, neither of us are going to say this is just weird alien stuff or something like that, like as if it's in a vacuum, it exists without context. No. If we're saying that everything is fundamentally spiritual, then there's a fundamentally spiritual paradigm that's going on in these areas. And if it is running amok for thousands of years, centuries over centuries, it's bad news, and it's going to make this whole area very bad news itself.
So, I think I was just reviewing Genesis 4:8. When they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know, am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground.
Yep.
So, this is another, the word Adamah, earth, arable ground, land owned. So, I think this is one of the things that, maybe this is too James Jordan influenced of me, but there's a reason that word's there. Mm-hmm. And if it's not, I think it's easy for us as Western modernist readers, with a very strong distinction between, especially as a very strong distinction between what's spiritual and then what's, wink, wink, actual, what's real, what's touch and tangible. To read that as oh, that's just a poetic flourish. That's where it fell, so that's what it's good. But I don't know. I think you reckon seriously with. There's a reason it says ground,
right?
So it's not that much of a stretch to think where you spill a lot of innocent blood might cry out louder than another voice.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, if there is an atrocity committed, that holds a lot of weight. And that might last longer than a generation of those people who died in horrible means. And this is not to over-supernaturalize everything, but I do think there's a point to be made that where we see the taking of life, it's a brutal thing. That's absolutely against the nature of God's created order, to murder someone else. And I think, going back to previous conversations, we try and make the case that there's a whole host of things that are involved in situations like these. It is the sinful caprice of man. As Jeremiah says, the heart is wicked beyond all means. Who can understand it? Just being alive is depravity. But there's also a lot of other agents who wish to capitalize on depravity and to enhance depravity and to take advantage of depravity. And That is, in the Native American parlance, the Star Brothers. We've talked about them before, right? These beings beyond the norm. And usually when they show up, it's bad news, because they are giving people bad medicine, to use the phrase. They're giving people things they shouldn't know. They're giving them power and information that are easily weaponized one to another. And we talked about the Aztec priests, I think, an episode or two ago, right? Like, if you're literally hell-bent on destroying humanity and besmirching the image of God, what better way to do that than to make man kill man? It's one thing if some sort of, angelic reaper shows up and kills the Anasazi. It's another if you get the Anasazi's brothers and cousins and kin to kill each other.
Yeah.
That is so much more brutal, because you are having image bearers destroy image bearers. And if you are playing the long con of pulling strings behind the scenes and trying to incite chaos among the righteous, then having them do your dirty work for you, checkmate. That's the best formula in the cookbook. Maybe I'm mixing metaphors there, but I think my point is that
the old Anasazi cookbook.
The old to serve man. Woof. But I think my point is that every time you see, and this is something, maybe it's an aside, but I think it's related. We think about paranormal activity, just period. As a subject of study, it's like you don't see a ghost because it's just a random person. It's like somebody who was murdered. You see the ghost of, Mamie Thurman in West Virginia. It's because she was taken before a time, she was killed in cold blood. Then you see the ghost of Mamie Thurman. Or you see, this place where a bunch of people have spent generations venerating weird gods in a holler. All of a sudden, goblins come out of a cave. Almost always, paranormal activity is centered around sadism and pain. More often than not. Even the Mothman. Think about the Mothman, right? Like, he shows up as a harbinger, quote unquote, of this great disaster that took the casualty number of dozens of people in the death at the collapse of the Silver Bridge.
Yeah.
In a context where already you had the people of Aracoma being killed by settlers who were just kind of wantonly destroying life. And so I don't want to make too big of a conjecture here, but I think about how, like, what does it take that you end up with a place like Skinwalker Ranch that is so filled with just bonkers activity? Whether or not you're in the Ancient Aliens Twitch chat, watching in real time the History Channel, or you are actually just trying to reckon with the fact that, like, a lot of pain has been inflicted in a place. What does it take when you have a place that is the haunted epicenter of the world?
Yeah.
Is that feeding something? Is that enabling something? Is that allowing something to cross over? We talked about that too, like, the old Jack Parsons thing. Like, is that even really the paradigm? I don't know. I honestly don't know. Yeah. But I'm just trying to spitball here and thinking that if you see, as we say, high strangeness, the higher the strangeness, probably the more pain, sadly, had to come at the cost of allowing this to be something that is now entrenched and known and perpetual generation after generation. Like the Skinwalker thing you said earlier, even if you're not murdering someone you love.
Yeah, you give
the ritual involves basically like substituting someone innocent for the sake of power. And even if that's all it is, we don't know how those details pan out, but it's a depraved thing, because you are basically giving up someone who has no stake in your own ambition to be manipulated or mutilated or destroyed or,
Yeah.
But that's it. None of these rituals, in terms of First Nation parlance, come without great cost.
Yeah.
And that's a great cost of human life, which is the most valuable thing in the universe, period. There's nothing greater than an image bearer of God, and if they are killed in the service of something dark, how much darker is that reverberation?
Do you have any theory on the people following us at the end of it?
That's very interesting, because there's a good amount of time given to that pursuit, and I have no doubt it is harrowing. Like, I would not want to be in that situation, out in the middle of the desert with, like, somebody clearly keeping tabs on you, especially with the guys back at the camp who are trying to, like, spotlight you to say something's wrong. At the risk of being conspiratorial, I think that if you are trying to shed gospel interpretation onto a dark place, those who are aligned against that effort are going to be pissed off that you are. And, like, there's no way I can look at Skinwalker Ranch and everything around it and think this is just spiritually neutral. Yeah. No, it's bad. It is a bad place where bad things happen. As Johnny said, it's a dark place for dark people. And when he said that, I thought, that's the summation right there.
It's a great soundbite.
It's a tremendous line that he shares. So obviously I'm not in that context. I can't speak to it directly, but there were many comments made. I mean, even as you were driving out there, you went through that, like, ghost town. And I was like, this is where you're not going to get killed by a skinwalker, you're just going to be killed by a serial killer.
Yeah.
And that's fair, because that's just human darkness. I think that, I'm trying to say this carefully, I am convinced that something with as much potency as a place like Skinwalker Ranch, and that whole, like, the western half of America is so spiritually strange. And that's where we hear about deep underground military bases. That's where we hear about crash sites of UFOs. That's where we hear about, like, the Dulce Mesa encounter where, aliens are wielding energy weapons against U.S. government officials. I mean, it's bizarre, dark stuff. It would not surprise me in the slightest that if well-meaning Christian people want to come and earnestly encounter and reckon with and reconcile and interpret and understand bad spiritual stuff, that there might be human agents who are aligned with the other side of the pale who want to stop you from doing that. And it could be as simple as that's not even the case, and it's just some guys who saw, a bunch of East Coast city slickers come out, and maybe we'll rob them and take their stuff. Maybe that's all it is. It's probably more likely that's the case. However, I do think there's a grain of salt worth chewing on to think that the intent of your expedition, as it were, was to try and shed revealing light on deliberate darkness. And that's an affront to people who want to keep it concealed. Is that fair?
Yeah. 4 things that did not make the film that I want to throw at you and see if it changes what you think about that.
Yeah, sure.
And reinforces it, maybe. The first is earlier in the week, we had visited this, like, it was like an elk boneyard where people had left lots of elk carcasses. They had taken the antlers and left the rest. And we thought that someone had followed us back from that. Like, There was a truck that pulled in below us, and then when we pulled out, we thought they had followed us back to Space Wolf.
Yeah.
When we told Johnny that, like, a couple days after, he said, he was like, well, I'll put it like this. This Skinwalker phenomenon, those are physically, they're people.
Yeah.
But they have like, and he was like searching for a word, and he goes, he was like, I call it a cult. He was like, people that help, basically. And he was like, they might have just, people interested in why you're at this boneyard. So anyway, there's a data point. Secondly, you mentioned Dulce. So when S4 at Area 51 got sort of publicly acknowledged, and I think that was related to Lazar.
Yep.
I can't say who told us that. There was a person who came by Spaceway the day before we got followed, who had history in government, and had related to us that they thought, and they had a history in government and were in a position to where they had decent cause to suspect that there was something built under the area.
Yeah, the Uinta Basin.
Yep. And said that when S4 got publicly recognized, Area 51, that those operations and craft were moved to Dulce Air Force Base.
Yep.
And that underneath, there was a mag rail. He suggested that there was a mag rail train possibly built underneath from Las Vegas Airport that runs to Dulce, so that the personnel weren't flying into Dulce. Like
right.
They
got their
anonymity. They could fly into and as a corroborating piece of that puzzle, there's a guy who's in the film, James Keenan, who came by and was taking gravity readings, and he'd done like ground penetrating radar, and I think he's even been on that Skinwalker show. But he had taken a measurement at the Triangle, Skinwalker Ranch, and taken a measurement where basically right under where we camped, where the shipping container got moved. And further north at Blind Frog Ranch, which is, have you seen, are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
Okay, that's a show that's actually probably worth watching. But anyway, so he had taken these 3 points and discovered the same thing, and the thing that his instruments indicated was that there was a cavity, but sometimes there was a huge spike in gravity and EMF and electromagnetic force in those 3 spots.
Yep.
So what might explain that is a cavity is an empty train tunnel, an empty mag rail tunnel.
Yep.
And then when the mag rail goes live, so it shoots, major magnetism train on the rail underneath as it travels. So the guy that told us that was there the day prior to when we were followed. And when someone, if Joseph hadn't been back at camp, would have, they demonstrated for all the world like they were going to come out to the camp.
Yeah.
Shoot, I said 4 things, and now I'm blanking. Anyway, is any of that... Wait, do you think any of that plays into the being followed thing?
I wouldn't be surprised. And I say that not as some conspiratorial person, but I think we have so much evidence, including congressional hearings, to say there is something untoward going on in our government structure. That's not me with Alex Jones and InfoWars. That's just saying, like, there's clear evidence that stuff happens that is meant not to be seen, and is meant not to be followed, and is meant not to be followed up upon. And in most of those stories, it's like the hapless documentary filmmaker who wanders onto the site and has disappeared. Because they see stuff they're not supposed to see.
We're trying. We're working on it.
I mean, again, like, it is probably most of Area 51, S4 included, fabricated in the public consciousness, my consciousness, probably. Not all of it.
Yeah.
And because it's not all of it, I think it's valid to consider. Dulce Base as well. I mean, that's just a wild story. That's buck wild. But also, we also know, like, you know, there are, at this point, it's something like $3.5–4 billion poured into the Cheyenne Mountain Complex alone. Yeah. And no one knows where that money goes. And that's where they got the Stargate, because I've watched the series. You know, thank you, Sci-Fi Channel. There's weird stuff that's going on that's totally undocumented, and it's black book stuff, and it's unelected official stuff. And again, that's not me trying to be weird. I'm just saying, I wouldn't be surprised if there is something related to Uinta Basin that is maybe a holding pattern or some facility built deep underground. It's the kind of thing where it's like we can't know, but we also can't not know, because there's so much corroborative evidence of foul play, or at least under the radar activity. So I think it's fair that we started this conversation talking about the weaponization of the paranormal. Well, who wants to weaponize the paranormal? Mm-hmm. Who has the means to weaponize the paranormal? And again, I go back to Spirit and Bailey with the UFO deception. There is active collaboration between, I'm not going to say well-meaning, but I will say forward-thinking government agencies that want to investigate this stuff because it is real. So where's the cross point between what they think is going on and what's actually going on? Is there an intersection point in Utah? Again, everything in the American West is just kind of like a big question mark for me. And I don't say that to, get likes on my YouTube channel, because I don't have one. It's to say that as I think about this stuff, if even the conjecture is plausible, it's probably plausible. So it could be that while you were at Space Wolf, as you're poking around and looking at, the spot and the spill, as it were, and trying to match a pattern to it, that's something that maybe somebody doesn't want you to see.
Yeah.
It could also be that there's just a desecrated demonic influence there that also wants you to bug off, stop bothering what's going on here. I'm unsurprised if I were to find that spiritual darkness doesn't want observers. They want collaborators. And if you're not a collaborator, get the heck off my Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to bring up, only because I did this for Operation Dogman, is to read the terrible IMDb review of this, because it brings me joy to see a 1 out of 10 star review of a totally innocuous YouTube event, Merkel Media, doing the good stuff they do. However, here's the feature review for Shape of Shadows. Title, What If Garbage? I don't even know what that means. Do you see that light? LOL. Yeah, lights exist. If you want to waste an hour of your life on this trash, go ahead, because this excuse is filled with blurry lights, bad camera work. That's a riff directly on you, Ward. Convoluted script and nonsensical voice overdubs. Basically, a bunch of guys go camping in Utah and discover nothing extraordinary. Yet skinwalkers, where you say? Not in this trashy excuse for a film where nothing exciting happens. There is nothing here but imaginative trying really hard to make believe. That's not even a sentence. Conspiratorial. That's also not a word. Try hard mythological exploitation, using two Native Americans as basic props to conjure a fake narrative for this They can't spell conspiratorial. It gets even worse.
It's hard. It's a big word.
For this conspiratorial trash is pure exploitation. Avoid. Life is short. Did you find this review helpful? Current score, -4. Do you have...
4 people did not find it helpful.
4 people said, this is not a helpful review. Do you have a retort?
Yeah, I mean, you can...
This guy at least didn't ask for his money back, which we still promised that last viewer.
Yeah.
Never got back to us.
Well, hey, if he does get in contact with me, I will give him his money back.
I will send the $1.
Yeah, I would say... Yeah, part of the reason that the shows that I do look the way that they do is because I refuse to restage anything. And obviously I refuse to stage anything as far as phenomena, but I refuse to I'm not gonna have people act like they're shaking hands. Mm-hmm. I despise it. I hate reality TV, and it probably, and we've gotten better at the voiceover thing. Is a totally fair criticism, and the reason that it is that way is because we are learning as we go, and we got genuinely caught off guard a whole bunch of times and didn't have time to do the YouTube vlog thing and turn to the camera and be like, so we're here doing this and this, but we're trying to force that a little bit more, just okay, tell me what's happening, why are you reacting to things? But everything was very, happened out of nowhere and wasn't planned, and we ended up, so that I think is a valid criticism, and it's one that we have for the show too.
You heard it here first, folks. It's a valid criticism.
But the name of exploiting Johnny and Poe, I don't think makes a ton of sense. Johnny's the he is Ryan's advisor.
He's like a security detail, isn't he?
No, that was a different guy.
Oh, it's a different guy. Okay. But he's with Space Wolf Research.
Yes. Yeah, he's their contact with the tribes in the area. And
well, I mean, the 2 Native Americans were basic props to conjure a fake narrative for conspiratorial.
It was pretty conspiratorial.
Conspiratorial trash.
Yeah. It was pretty... Yeah.
Get back to me, not today, 572, if you can spell conspiratorial correctly.
We didn't go, the stuff that we talked about is way more conspiratorial than anything that we did in the doc. And
yeah, for sure. For sure.
That source, we could have, anonymized and leaned into that angle. But again, we wanted to, we were trying to focus on what Johnny and Bo and the people, the local people that live there all the time, said that was kind of the thing, was allow them to tell their story in their framing.
Right.
If we happen to experience something, that's even better.
But again, that's on brand for the confessionals anyway, because it's just to say hey, let me know what you think.
Yeah.
Tony's not there to be like, Johnny, please read the script. He's saying, actually, tell me what you deal with interacting with this stuff.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I won't stage stuff is because you can tell when someone has to, like, when they're saying a thing the second time.
Yeah, that becomes a Zach Baggins special.
Yeah.
Where's the Dybbuk box that you opened in the Uinta Basin?
I think I'm getting possessed. Yeah.
I guess my closing question, Ward, is what is the point of Shape of Shadows?
Well, I think it's similar to a lot of the stuff that I'm doing. The point is to force people to confront the fact that the world is not a materialistic, mechanistic thing that is explained because you have names for all the phenomena you're interested in. So, just because you have a name for gravity does not mean that you have explained what's happening. There's a whole bunch of experiences that people have that fall outside of being able to be explained in those terms. And from that big point, there's a point for a Christian audience, and there's a point for a non-Christian audience. And the point for the Christian audience is your worldview needs to account for this, and to be prepared to give an account for it, because you're going to run into people that have had these experiences, and you don't want your only mechanism of addressing those people to be Xanax. And for the non-Christian audience, the point is hopefully that the Christian worldview accounts for these experiences, and the gods that you worship, for people that are practicing paganism and all of its of all colors, the things that you're interacting with are real. And we 100% affirm that you've had the experiences that you've had with those things. And also to consider the possibility that there is deception at play in that relationship that you have with these unseen entities, because Christ is King. And every other god will relate to you via exploitation. And it may not be obvious at first. It's probably not. They have thousands and thousands of years of practice at making it not obvious and really convincing. But there's a trade being made for your soul. And the only freedom is to abandon those gods and come to Christ.
Thank you again for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, look for new episodes to be dropped at the feed in the description, and the entire backlog of the Ohio Howl to be added there as well. Remember to follow, share, like, and subscribe if you think we've done a good job. Hop on the Discord and join the discussion. All those links, as well as links to our social media, are in the description. And as always, stay tethered.